This is lesson 6 of our study of Bible history in the Old Testament, 6 of 48 lessons. Turn to your outline on lesson 6 because we need to look at a map there. If you don't have an outline, please get one, either from the sponsor of the program where you are or write us and we'll send you one. If you don't have an outline, what you might want to do is take a piece of paper and starting up at the very top of that piece of paper, about nearly 40% of the way over, start a line down that will reach the left-hand side of the paper about 2/3 of the way down, and just make it a squiggly line, a little less than halfway down. Put a little camel's hump in it, and go on down to the page. And that'll be the coastline of Palestine and the Mediterranean Sea. And then halfway down the page, write another little squiggly line. Put a little lake about 1/3 of the way down, and then a little circle about 2/3 of the way, about half of the way down, about 2/3 of the way down. Put a long oval-looking thing. That'll be the waters of Merom, Sea of Galilee, and the Dead Sea. If you got an outline, just follow along, because there's some geographical things that are going to be important in the study of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the others that follow. And so on your outline, notice that we have the first point, the map of Old Testament Palestine. In Old Testament Palestine, geographically, can be divided into 4 geographical sections that will not change no matter who rules the land. The first is the coastal plain, sort of self-explanatory. It's on that line that we just drew, the coast of the Mediterranean, and going from south to north, you have the plain of Philistia down at the bottom, and the Philistines who live there in the plain of Philistia are going to be a constant thorn in Israel's side. Now, above the plain of Philistia and right up to that hump in the sea that we drew, which is Mount Carmel, you have the plain of Sharon. Very beautiful vegetation grows there. As a matter of fact, you've probably heard of the lily of the valley and the rose of Sharon. It's not really a rose, but it's a beautiful red and pink flower that grows there in the plain of Sharon. Now, at the hump in the sea, coming down into the middle of the country on an angle, is called the Valley of Jezreel, or the plain of Esdraelon. There's where Megiddo is, and Armageddon, the hill of Megiddo, is there. It's the great battlefield in the Old Testament day. Today in Israel, it's a beautiful orange grove area. And then the Shephelah is a little row of hills between the coastal plain and the central mountain range that forms a buffer state between the two nations that will live there. And then when you leave the coastal plain, you come into a mountain range that runs all the way down Palestine, and we call it the Central Range because it's halfway between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. It divides itself into the Upper Galilean Range, which is north, the Lower Galilean Range, which is between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, the hill country of Ephraim, which is right on the border between Israel and Judah, and then Judea and the Negev. And so this is the mountain range, the mountains of Galilee, the mountains of Ephraim, the mountains of Judea, and then outside of the mountains, the south country. That's what Negev means. The Jordan Valley, then, is the valley through which the Jordan River flows, and in which valley you have 3 lakes, the waters of Merom, the Sea of Galilee, and the Dead Sea. The Jordan River is a very, very interesting river. We could talk for days, at least I could, talk for days about that river. It is only, as the crow flies, about 135 miles long. But when you trace all of the river bed, it's over 225 miles long. Between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, it winds like a serpent. And most of the days of the year, if you were flying over it, you'd see that winding serpent. But for about 2 months of the year, that river flows from one bank to the other bank, a rushing torrent from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. The Jordan River would flow all the way to the Red Sea, except for the big hole at the bottom of it called the Dead Sea. There are 3 waters on that river. 2 of them extremely important for our study. One of them fairly important. First is Lake Hula, or the waters of Merom, and there's where a city is there called Hazar, And several times there'll be the gathering of the tribes of the land in Hazor to make a confederacy against the people of God. So it'll be a place of gathering for the enemies of God. Then there's the Sea of Galilee, or as it's sometimes called, Chinneroth. It is an interesting body of water in and of itself, but it is a part of the lifeblood of Galilee because it's a great fishing lake, and many fishermen have made their living there from the dawn of time. The water is 685 feet below the level of the sea. The lake is 9 miles long and about 7 miles across, and it has never been fished out. It is a beautiful, clear, commercially beneficial lake. The Jordan River flows out of it bigger than it flows into it. And it flows down to the Dead Sea, also called in the Bible the Salt Sea. To me, the most interesting single place geographically in all the world. The surface of that Dead Sea is 1,292 feet below the level of the sea. That's a pretty high hill if you just turn it up. The sea at its deepest point is 1,300 feet deep plus. That means that the hole that this lake or sea is in is 2,600 feet below the level of the sea. That would be a good-sized mountain if you were to turn it up. No water flows out of that sea. That's why it's called dead. Its water is salty because only way any water gets out is by evaporation. And through the centuries of evaporation, that sea has become over 25% solid. If you were to take a pint jar of Dead Sea water and sit up on the shelf and leave it there for a while, before long, 25% of that bottle of water would be absolutely solid. Of course, it had been that way all along, but it would have settled to the bottom. They mine millions of tons of potash out of that lake every year, and it still stays the same height. There's no way that you could drown in that sea unless you intended to, because you can lay flat on your back on it and you float. Even if you don't want to float, you float because it's 1/4% solid. Below that Dead Sea, the rift that river is flown in continues. And except for that hole, the Jordan River would keep on flowing. That rift goes all the way down to the Red Sea, goes underneath the Gulf of Aqaba's wing of the Red Sea, goes under that gulf, comes out on the other side, goes down through the Sudan, down through Kenya, and I've driven for several hours through the Great Rift in Kenya, where they have a game preserve, and that rift goes on and ends in the Transvaal Mountains of South Africa, the most magnificent geographical fault in all the world. It was as if something or someone just ripped open the earth at that spot. I'm sure it's the result of the flood. That's the Jordan Valley. On the other side of the Jordan Valley is the Eastern Range, or what's called the Tableland. And there you have really a few mountains, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you have three basic geographical and national borders. Down in the south, parallel to the Dead Sea, you've got the country of Moab. Moab, as we'll study later on, is the result of an incestuous relationship between Lot and one of his daughters. So this is a kinsman to Israel. And then Gilead is the territory between the Dead Sea and just above the Sea of Galilee, and that's a geographical designation, and many nations will live in that country of Gilead. There is many beautiful springs in Gilead, and the mud, because the springs are mineral springs, the mud has healing qualities, and that's why sometimes you sing a song, "Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there?" And then above Gilead is the geographical section of Bashan. Actually, it's first of all political, but it gives a geographical name to it, and many nations will live there. And here they raise the fattest of cows and steers. The country is a beautiful farming country, and the grain grows, over the head of the animals. And fat cows and fat bulls are grown in Bashan. So it's another very economically important area. On your outline, we list many mountains. Mountains are significant in the Bible because many times God will bring a person up onto a mountain to offer sacrifice or to hear from Him, or man will seemingly go to a high place. Because God is high and lifted up, man wants to go to a high and lifted up place to approach God in prayer and in commitment and in sacrifice. Starting on the west side of the Jordan, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, you have this central range we talked about. Way up in the north is a mountain very important in many of the political discussions today, and that's Mount Lebanon. There the cedars grow that Solomon will build his house and much of the temple from. Coming just south of that is Mount Meron, and it doesn't have really any great Old Testament significance, but one battle will be fought there. Coming on down to just the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, and about halfway between the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Ocean are the Horns of Hattin, one mountain with two peaks, and it's called the Horns of Hattin, and that's probably the Beatitude Mountain. That's probably where Jesus spoke the Beatitudes. Coming on down to the southern end of the Sea of Galilee, and a little bit closer to the Sea of Galilee than the Mediterranean Sea, is Mount Tabor, where many of Israel's armies will gather to go fight against their enemies. Then just right below that is the hills of Morah, which is Little Hermon, thought by some to be the mountain upon which Abraham will offer Isaac. Going inward a bit is Mount Gilboa. They form a valley. There is a valley formed between Mount Tabor and Mount Gilboa where many battles are fought. Then go to that hump in the sea, that camel's hump that we put out there on our little squiggly line that went down on our map. That's Mount Carmel. It's from that mountain that Elijah will look out and finally prophesy about a great rain to come. It's on that mountain he defeats the Baal prophets and kills 450 of them. It's an important mountain in the Bible. South, just before you get to the northern end of the Dead Sea, there are two sister mountains, or brother if you will, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. They're in the hill country of Ephraim. That's the Mount of Curse, Ebal, and the Mount of Blessing, Gerizim. Now it's called the Mount of Curse, Mount of Blessing, because Abraham was given the covenant of blessing and cursing in Deuteronomy 28 through 30 that he was to read to Israel when they got into the promised land. And the people were be in the valley below. You know, mountains and valleys make natural auditoriums. And so Moses and the priests could read the blessings from Gerizim, and the people would say amen. They'd read the curses from Ebal, and the people would say amen. And so those are the mountains in Ephraim. In Jerusalem itself, or around Jerusalem, are two important mountains in the Old Testament. Mount Zion, inside the walls, and the Mount of Olives, just outside the walls. Now Jerusalem is just below the northern end of the Dead Sea, about 20 miles inland. Coming on south to about 2/3 of the way down the Dead Sea, you have Mount Hebron. And this is the mountain that Abraham will live near. And this is one of the mountains that Samson will dwell upon. It's a very important biblical mountain. Those are the 12 mountains west of the Jordan River. On the east, there are only 3 mountains of significance, again going from the north to the south. Up in the north is Mount Hermon. Be more important in the New Testament than in the Old, but there'll be several important incidences there. Then Mount Gilead, which is about halfway between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, right on the edge of the desert. And this is an important place primarily because it makes a barrier between Israel and their enemies. And then Mount Nebo, which is just east of the northern end of the Dead Sea, and here it is that Moses will view the promised land from. Now I know that geography in and of itself is not very interesting, except to people that like it. But this is the geography upon which most of the Old Testament history will be performed. And geography determines many times much of what happens. And so we'll be able to now and then, as we're studying, refer to these geographical facts that will help us understand what's being said in the Bible. Study that map. Get familiar with it, so that as we move Abraham and the other heroes around in Palestine, we'll know where they are and why it says sometimes they went up to and why it says sometimes they went down to. And we'll know why sometimes they are victorious over their enemies and sometimes they're defeated by their enemies, because they either possess this mountain stronghold or they don't possess this mountain stronghold. Now, as far as I know, that's all the geography that we're going to study for a good long while. We'll not look at any more geography till we get to the history of God's people in Egypt. And then it'll be necessary that we talk a little bit about the geography and the history of Egypt. Now turn to Genesis 11, and let's start our Bible study. Let's start our study of history that this geography supports. Last time, we studied the incident, the story of the Tower of Babel. How instead of scattering and multiplying, replenishing the earth as God wanted them to do, they consolidated and decided they were going to stay at one place. And they were going to build a tower that they thought would extend into heaven itself in order to keep themselves one nation and a united people and not have to scatter as God wanted them to scatter. God looked down from heaven and Godhead spoke to itself and said, if we do not do something about this, we will not be able to keep them from doing anything they want to do, since they're of one heart and one mind. So God has to somehow get them not to be united. So what he did, you remember last time in our study, was he confused their languages, and they began to speak in ways they couldn't understand one another, and so soon they scattered throughout all of the world. And a genealogy is given in chapter 11, beginning with verse 10. And I want to read this with you because this is a very important thing to see where Abraham came from. Now back in Genesis 5, you had in the whole chapter the first 10 generations of the earth, from Adam to Noah, the flood. Now 2 years after the flood, he picks up that genealogy and takes it 10 more generations to Abram. This is the account of Shem. 2 years after the flood, when Shem was 100 years old, so Shem was 98 when he walked off the ark, he became the father of Arphaxad. After he'd become the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and had other sons and daughters. So Shem lived 600 years. Now I'm not going to read all of this now, but I'm going to talk about father, son, and how long he lived. Arphaxad at 35 bore Shelah and lived 438 years. Shelah became the father of Eber and lived 433 years. Eber became the father of Peleg and lived 464 years. Peleg became the father of Reu and lived 239 years. Did you notice a drop down there? They had been living 900 years before the flood. Shem lived 600 years. He was a flood person. Then it drops down to 400. Now it's dropping down to 200. Reu became the father of Serug and lived 239 years. Serug became the father of Nahor and lived 230 years. Nahor became the father of Terah and lived 148 years, another drop down. Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now that's the account of Shem. 10 generations, and we've gone from Shem to Terah. An interesting thing is, Shem is still alive. Through all of this time, he's still alive even when Terah dies. He's alive when Abraham dies. He lives into the life of Jacob. Shem lived for 13 generations of people. And he could tell them for 13 generations what he'd heard directly from Methuselah, who'd heard directly from Adam, the story of the fall, the story of sin, the story of the flood, the story. History was being repeated by eyewitnesses or by those who talked to the eyewitness. Now Abraham's life begins in chapter 11 and verse 27. And as you read Genesis, you'll find that the prime character in the story is the son of the one whose generation we're talking about. The son is the prime star in the father's generation. If you'll read chapter 11, verse 27, It says this is the generation, or this is the account of Terah. And that'll go all the way through chapter 25. But it's the story of Abraham. Now, get in your mind, or look on your outline, at the outline of the map of the Old Testament world. Because we start out there with Abraham. We'll come to the map of Old Testament Palestine, where Abraham will spend the majority of his significant life. But he starts out in the Ur of the Chaldees. Now, if you've got that map in front of you, Ur's on that map. If not, remember it. And where the Tigris and the Euphrates River come together in Mesopotamia, on the Euphrates, just up a bit from where the rivers join, is the city of Ur. Ur's been dug up. It's been excavated. It was a city way beyond its time. The most modern city of its day. Most of the people not only lived in houses, when most of the world lived in tents, but they had running water in those houses. And most of them even had a way to heat that water. They had hot and cold running water. Each person had a bedroom, or at least many people. I had many bedrooms in each house, which was not normally the case either. If you built a house, it's normally just one big room. And you ate in it, you slept in it, you played in it. You did everything in that one single room. So Abraham was born in a city beyond its time, and he was a rich person because he's going to have many flocks and many servants and many slaves. And so when we talk about Abram, we're not talking about some, little farmer or a little shepherd. We're talking about a sheik. We're talking about a person who rules a large household, even for the very beginning of his time. We're going to look quickly in the next 5 minutes at the first 4 places in Abraham's journey, and then we'll pick up next time in the 5th. He starts out in the Ur of the Chaldees, and he is born. The statement is made that that Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Reading that, you'd think Abraham was the oldest, but if you read on, his father's going to live 205 years and die when Abraham's 75 years old. So Abraham is born in Terah's 130th year. Why is he named first then? Because he's what the Bible calls firstborn. He is the preeminent son of Terah. In Ur, there's only 2 things really to remember. His nativity. Here's where it is he was born. And the first call. I don't have that in Genesis. All I have in Genesis is that he and his father and Lot and some others moved from Ur all the way up to Haran in northern Mesopotamia. But in Acts chapter 7, verse 2 and 3, the text says God appeared to Abram there and said, get you out of your country. And so his father just went with him, but he had to wait till his father died to go on to Canaan. Why? Well, I don't find that out to the book of Joshua. I know we're hurrying, but we're studying this later. In the book of Joshua, I read that they're to choose whom they are to serve, whether the gods their fathers served beyond the Euphrates. Abraham's fathers were idolaters. That's why Abraham has to get out from among them. Otherwise, we're going to have a repetition of the flood. Evil people mixed with godly people end up evil. And so we don't want that to happen. So Abraham has to be separated and carried to a desert land in order not to have the same thing happen that happened in Genesis chapter 6. In Haran, again, simply 2 things. His father died at age 205, and the next verse says Abram was 75. And he had a second call to go to the land that God had chosen for him to go. Now, when God called him to go, Abraham didn't know where he was going. He didn't know why he was going. He didn't even know when he got there till God told him, this is the land. This is where I want you to be. That's what I call faith. To get up and go to a land you know nothing about, you don't have any assurance of the future, except that God has said, I'm going to go with you. Now, we're going to study next time a deal called the twofold promise that God makes here. He makes to Abraham a physical promise that he'll be with his nation. And he makes to Abraham a spiritual promise that he will bless all the nations of the earth. He travels into Canaan and comes to a place called Shechem, which is right between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. See the reason for the geography? And here Abraham begins to do a thing he does every time as soon as he arrives at a place. He builds an altar and calls upon God. But there's not enough pasture land there for his sheep. So he moves on, and he comes to a place called Bethel. Now, it won't be called really Bethel till later. When Abraham got there, it was called Luz, which means light. But later on, it'll be called Bethel, which means house of God, because here it is that God will appear to Jacob and give him the vision of the angels going up and down on the ladder. He's in the land now. He comes to Bethel. He does the two things he always does. He builds an altar, and he calls on God. But he can't stay there long again. Why? He's got lots and lots of sheep to pasture. And there's not much pasture there. So he has to move on. And the text says he moves on toward the Negev. We've got 1 minute left. And I'd like for you to think with me for a moment about Abraham's mind. What's Abraham thinking? I know what I'd be thinking. What are you doing, God? You took me from my home. You took me from a settled community. You took me from a fine house, and I'm living in tents, and I don't have anything to feed my sheep, and you said you were going to bless me. Where is that blessing that you offered me? Maybe Abraham didn't say that because he is building an altar, and he's calling on the Lord. When you don't know what the Lord is doing, when times are difficult, build your altar, call upon God, and wait by faith.